Hi, let's talk about big books. If you've been around for a little while, you might know that I have big book fear. Once upon a time, I avoided books that were over 350 pages long. But somehow I have managed to accumulate about 20 books that are longer than 500 pages. And to torment myself, I decided to make a spreadsheet listing all of them. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I have 20 books that are 500 pages or longer on my shelves. I have not counted some of my manga titles that are kind of like bind-ups and are quite long, because although they do technically classify, I wanted to sort of focus on the books that seemed very intimidating, the books that I'm likely to avoid simply because I know they're going to take me a long time to read. So 20 books, aside from manga, that are longer than 500 pages. 4 of those, however, are subsequent books in series that I have not started the series yet. So they are on my list of shame. I've just sort of like grayed them out for now. I have also added another 7 books to this list that are between 400 and 500 pages, but for whatever reason, they sort of fall into the category of intimidating, which means I have a list of 27 tomes. And in case you were wondering, that comes out for a total of over 15,000 pages that I need to get to. And I am going to show you all of these books in a minute. They're next to me, which is why my shelves look half empty and look like a total mess. But before we get to that, I first want to talk about my big book challenge of 2023. And that is that I want to try and read 10 of these books on my list before the end of the year. Now, I am aware that that is not even half, it's barely a third, and in an ideal world, I would love to smash all of these out, but I'm trying to be realistic. 10 feels like a really solid challenge considering I only read like 5 books over 500 pages last year. It's definitely a step outside of my comfort zone, but it also feels, at least at this stage of the game in January when I'm feeling pretty optimistic, it feels reasonably achievable. And to keep me accountable, what I would like to do is to vlog my experience of reading each of these books. I'm aiming for roughly 1 a month, obviously with a couple of months leeway, just to, you know, in case things happen, because things always happen. And to make things a little bit fun, from February, I'm also going to invite my Patreons to help me pick which one of these books I'm going to read that month. Basically, I'm planning to pick out 2 to 4 books on this list that I'm interested in reading in the near future, put a poll up on my Patreon, and then those lovely folks over there get to select which one I'm going to be reading. I say from January because I have actually already read one of these books this year. I'm off to a great start. Now, to be fair, a lot of these are fantasy books. I definitely picked up quite a lot of them last year when I decided I was getting into fantasy, but not all of them are. So now let's have a little bit of a chat about all of these books. The shortest book on this list is The Song of the Crocodile by Nadi Simpson. This scrapes in at 401 pages. This is an historical fiction novel, apparently with some magical realism elements. It's written by an Indigenous author here in Australia. It was released, I think, in 2019, and I bought it back in 2019. I have been wanting to read it for quite a while, but partly because it's chunky and partly because I've kind of veered away from this more like contemporary literary historical fiction stuff in the last couple of years. I just haven't gotten to it yet. Next, we have 100 Years of Solitude. I don't think this book needs much of an introduction, certainly not from someone like me who is entirely uneducated. I honestly don't know a lot about this book other than the fact that it's a classic and everybody loves it, and that I found this very pretty hardcover edition in my local little library. So now I have a copy too. This book comes in at 418 pages, so it's pretty chunky, but I don't think that's the only thing that's intimidating about this book. I think this is one of those books that, you know, its reputation precedes it a little bit, and that makes me a little bit anxious to get into it too. Next up, we have Cat's Eye by Margaret Atwood at 421 pages. Now, if you've noticed, I have an awful lot of Margaret Atwood books, and that is because Margaret Atwood is the author that like made me fall in love with reading when I was like 16. I read The Handmaid's Tale and Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, and I decided that I loved reading from that moment on. I've read a lot of Margaret Atwood's books, but I have not read all of them. And in the last couple of years, as I mentioned, I've sort of veered away from more lit fic, that sort of stuff. So I kind of haven't read anything by her in a couple of years. And I definitely would like to get to some more of her books, especially the ones that I already have on my shelf. And so this is the first of 2 of her books that are on this list. Next up at 436 pages is Still Life by Sarah Winman. I actually started reading this book in 2022, but almost immediately put it down. It is historical lit fic. Are we noticing a pattern here? I'm pretty sure I would have adored this book like 2 years ago, but I've missed my window and now I just keep putting it off. I feel like though, after my kind of foray with fantasy last year, I'm still interested in reading fantasy and other genre fiction, but I am coming back to a realization that I love lit fic for a reason. And while I don't want it to be the only thing I'm reading, I do still want to incorporate it into my reading. So this needs to be on the list. This one is a little bit different. This is Speak Bird, Speak Again, Palestinian Arab Folktales This comes in at 438 pages, so just beating out Still Life. And I say this is a little bit different because this is not a novel. I think everything else on this list is. This, though, is an anthology. It's a collection of stories and unheard voices from across historic Palestine, translated by native Palestinians. So not only is this pretty chunky, but it has a wealth of footnotes, which, I mean, footnotes are always a little bit intimidating. And I don't know that I read any short story collections or anthologies last year, so I feel like I need to change that this year. But this is definitely a pretty chunky book that I have been a little intimidated by that needed to be on this list. Next, at 450 pages, is An Amber in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. This is listed as a young adult high fantasy romance, and it's the first in a quartet that I've heard really good things about. And then the last of the honorable mentions at 477 pages is KKE. From memory, this is a retelling of the Ramayana, but told from a female character's perspective. So kind of in the vein of something like Circe, which has been very popular and is also on my shelf that I haven't read yet. But this one came out last year and I just heard really great things about it. And I also like that it's a fantasy standalone. Okay, now we are up to the books that are over 500 pages long, and an awful lot of these are just the first books in fantasy series I have yet to start. The first is Foundryside by Robin Jackson Bennett. It barely scrapes over the 500 page line at 504 pages long. This is the first in the Founders trilogy, and I think it's a fantasy or sci-fi story. Next we have City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty at 518 pages long. This is the first in the Daevabad trilogy, another one I've heard great things about, and honestly one I have a very good feeling about. And with one more page at 519 pages long is The Winter Garden by Alexandra Bell. This is a standalone historical fantasy novel. It sounds very atmospheric. Next is The Blind Assassin at 521 pages long. This is obviously more literary historical fiction, and this is the book that Margaret first won the Booker Prize for in 2000. I'm saying Margaret like we're on a first name basis. At 528 pages is The Art of Prophecy. This is the first book in the War Art Saga by Wesley Chu. This is a pretty new book, I think, and so I think this is the only book out in the series so far. I don't know how long it's going to be, but saga makes me think longer than 3 books. This was honestly a bit of an impulse buy. I heard a couple of really good things about it. It was a very pretty cover. So I don't know, it's on my shelf and I need to read it. Next we have the first book in the Tamir Triad. It's The Bone Doll's Twin by Lynn Flewelling, and this comes in at 530 pages long. I picked up this entire trilogy secondhand while I was in Bateman's Bay for like $12 for the entire series. So this is one of those series where books 2 and 3 are also on my list of books over 500 pages long, but obviously I can't read books 2 and 3 before I read this one. So I'm not going to talk any more about those in this video. Just know that they are on the list, although they are grayed out. And if and when I get to and hopefully like this book, I will also get to those. At 534 pages is The Ninth Reign by Jen Williams. This is the first book in the Winnowing Flame trilogy. I've heard that this series can be a little bit tricky to get into, which adds to the intimidation factor, but pretty much everyone that I've heard who's like gotten through that first little hump has really gone on to enjoy it. I personally just love how floppy this book is. Okay, now for another historical lit fic. It is Pachinko. This comes in at 535 pages long, and I just love this cover. And a couple of years ago, I was really into like intergenerational historical fiction. I loved that stuff. Haven't been reading so much of it lately, but I don't want to unhaul this because I feel like it's something I might come back around to. Next, at 536 pages long is Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. This is a YA fantasy romance kind of story, and I think it's a duology. And obviously the length, it's pretty chunky, that's pretty intimidating, but the other thing that adds to the intimidation factor for this for me is how much people love this book. And so far I don't have a great track record of adoring the high fantasy books that BookTube loves. But what can I say? I'm an optimist. I'm going to keep trying. And I mean, a pretty cover like this doesn't hurt. At 538 pages long, we have The Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri. This is an epic fantasy and the first book in the Burning Kingdoms trilogy. Again, another one I keep hearing great things about. And I think this one's sapphic. Then at 556 pages long, a book that I got for my birthday is Babel by R.F. Kuang. This was kind of one of the books of 2022, but we all know that I don't read up to date well enough as I should. So who knows? I might be reading this in 2023. Okay, we're up into the 600 plus page category now. The first is The Sword of Kaigan by M.L. Wang. This comes in at 633 pages. Happily though, this is a standalone and it's a high fantasy novel that I've just heard incredible things about. I think it's independently published and it's a little bit of like a gem in the fantasy world. At 643 pages is The Golem and the Jinni by Helene Wecker. Honestly, I picked this up on a whim, but a couple of my friends on GoodReads have read it and rated it very highly. I think this is also part of a series. I think there's currently 2 books out. I don't know if there's going to be more though. Okay, now we're at the 5th longest book that I have on my shelf, and it is one of those books that is part of a series that I own all books of, and they all are in the top 5. The first book, The Theft of Swords, this yellow one, is 691 pages long. To be fair, these are bind-ups. I think there's 6 books technically in the series, so you get 2 books in each book, but like, for all intents and purposes, these are 3 chunky books, and they're really hard to get out of this box one-handed. So I'm just going to show you this briefly, but I need to put it down because it's very heavy. The next longest book is actually also a bind-up, and that is Seed to Harvest by Octavia Butler. This is 760 pages long, but it is a bind-up of, I think this is a series. Is that right? The Patna series. Yes, this is 4 novels in one bind-up. I don't think I've read any of Octavia E. Butler before. I hear such good things, but because she's kind of like a classic icon of sci-fi and fantasy, I don't know, I'm a little intimidated. Like I said, books 2 and 3 of the Ryuri Revelations are also in the top 5 for my longest books on my shelves. They are the longest and the 3rd longest book. But obviously being books 2 and 3 in series, like I can't get to those until I've gotten to book 1. So coming in at the longest book on my shelf aside from those, it's the 2nd longest overall, is Priory of the Orange Tree. This is 830 pages long. The good news is though, I've already read this. I read this in January. I figured I'd start this challenge off strong, and I'm so proud of myself. I'll leave a link to the reading vlog where I read this in the cards above for you. Unfortunately, I didn't really like it very much, but I did get through it. I got through it, and that feels good. So those are all my massive, intimidating tomes that I have on my shelf, and I'm hoping to get to 10 of these this year. Like I said, my goal is to read 1 of these a month with a little bit of wiggle room, and I would love to vlog the experience of reading each of these with you. So if you are on my Patreon, please be on the lookout for polls where you can help me choose which book I'm going to be reading. And with your help, I hope to make a decent chunk in this list by the end of 2023. I really wish I could hold them all up for you because that would be quite an impressive thumbnail, but like that's just not happening at the moment. In the meantime, I would love to hear in the comments below if you have any tomes that are like kind of sitting, languishing on your TBR that you need to get to in 2023. And of course, a very big thank you to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie. And of course, thank you for watching, especially if you made it all the way to the end of this video. I will talk to you in the comments and in the next video. Until then, happy reading. Bye.